The Hay Band Network. Welcome to the Hay Band Network. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Richard Floyd, joining us. Welcome to the Hay Band Network, sir.
Well, it's great to be here, Chad. Thank you for letting me hang out with you for a while.
You recently published a book entitled The 7 Deadly Sins of Music Making. This is your second book. The first book, The Artistry of Teaching and Making Music, was published a few years back. And so talk to us a little bit about 7 Deadly Sins of Music Making.
Okay, I'd be glad to. I go in a little bit more detail about this in the preface of the book, but just where the whole thing came from. The first book, The Artistry of Teaching and Making Music, that started out as a journal that I kept for a long time of just things that worked for me when I was rehearsing. And I'd go back to my room and I'd write them down, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger. And then from there, I thought, well, if I'm going to put these together with some kind of reality for people, there needs to be a reason for why we're doing all this. It's not just to fix the problem or to correct the notes or refine the rhythms, but to also, what does that have to do with the artistry, what we do? So that kind of created the whole preamble for the way that book came together. I never had any thought about doing a second book at that time. And if there's anybody that I have to blame for this, it would be Bruce Beach out in El Paso. I was out there doing a region band, and he was president of TBA, and he came up to me and asked me if I would do a clinic at TBA for him. And I told him, I said, look, I've done plenty of clinics. Nobody wants to hear me anymore. There's a lot of people out there that have so much to share. And finally I said, I'll tell you what, call me in a couple of weeks and we'll talk about it. My fingers were crossed that he would not call. He would get busy with all of his other TBA duties and I would not hear from him. Lo and behold, the phone rang and we talked for a while. And finally I said, yes. And he immediately said, great, Dick, now what are you going to talk about? And I paused for a second. I said, I think I'll talk about the 7 deadly sins of making music. And he said, great, and hung up. And I looked out the window and thought, what in the hell did I just get myself into? I have no idea what any of that means. But that prompted me to start thinking about what are our sins and how does that all play out? And the more I thought about it, I came to the realization that really and truly, these are not sins of commission. They are sins of omission. They're sins, the things that we fail to do. And sometimes we substitute less challenging sins to kind of circumvent and get around it. So that was kind of the way that it all started. And then the more I got into it, the more infatuated I became with it. I had lots of conversations with other conductors, with composers. I had some wonderful conversations with Eric Whitaker, with Frank DeKelly, and with John Mackey, Brian Baumagers. And it became very clear that these are things that we have to deal with every day. And the fact that we tend to kind of put them in a box and try not to have to worry about them, that's when the sins start to happen. So that was kind of the way that it all occurred. And I also, one other sidebar, I guess, is the fact that I thought immediately, I guess I better figure out what the original 7 deadly sins were and what they represented. And so I did some research on that. And the main thing, I'm not going into detail on that, but those were sins that hindered spiritual growth. And so I started thinking, what are the sins that hinder musical growth? What are the things that we need to delve into or avoid that would deepen what we bring to our students in terms of musicality? And so that's kind of how it all unfolded, how it got started. And it just kept getting bigger and bigger. And GIA was very receptive. And I had a wonderful editor that helped me with some of the specifics of it. So it's out there for whatever it's worth for whoever that cares to look at it. But it was fun putting it together.
Well, it's great. And, you know, whenever we get to stand in front of bands on a daily basis and a full ensemble, all the resources and the the different things that you go through and some of the elements that we deal with through your set sins are just great. It's an enjoyable read, and it's refreshing, and lots of great examples through that also. So how do you perceive a director or music director or conductor at any level that can use this resource?
I am not in any way saying I'm trying to tell somebody how they need to do something. But I do think that my goal was to create a springboard for people to think more interpretively and more artistically about what we do, and to push the boundaries of what it means to make music. The band world is very organized and very structured. We know how to do stuff, and I don't think anybody can do it any better. I've got a big kick out of what's been going on Facebook and other places about the fact that if you had a band director in charge, there would be no problem with social distancing and face masks. I think that's probably absolutely true. We know how to do stuff. But in order to do stuff, you also have to be very structured. And that's not a bad thing by any means, but if you allow yourself, you can become so structured that you miss the whole artistry and the beauty of why we're doing all this. So I think more than anything else, I just wanted to challenge directors to think about learning just the notes on the page. It may get you a one contest, but as far as it touching the actual depth of the music, then maybe there's more to it than that. There's a wonderful quote. This is Mallory Thompson, Northwestern, says that if you play what is on the page, you probably will be wrong. It's the depth, looking behind the notes, inside the notes, and how the notes relate to each other. So that's kind of what I hope people will think about as they look at the text and look at the content of the book.
And going through it, I could say it doesn't matter the level of program and student you teach or whatever. This is something that everybody, I think, can take some insight into and to continue to evaluate how we're running our rehearsal and what we're focusing on. So it's great stuff. So, well, let's get into it. Let's get into your 7 deadly sins in our music making world.
Okay, well, the 7 deadly sins, it took me a while to narrow it down to what they were. And I ended up with articulation, dynamics, rhythm, tempo, line, silence, and proportion. And somebody could easily say, oh, of course, we work on articulation, we work on dynamics, we do all this stuff. But then I thought it was important to push the envelope that maybe there's more to it than just those particular terms. Maybe a few modifiers would help us to think about the fact that really one of the challenges with articulation is that we tend to teach articulation, I think, as a means to achieve precision. We want notes to start together. We want notes to stop together. Yeah, some notes are going to be long, some notes are going to be short. But as far as the articulation itself, we just simply have created this very narrow definition of what each of these marks mean. And if we achieve that, we feel like we are being successful. But I have decided to take the approach that articulation is musical diction. It's what creates the personality and the shape of the notes. Articulation is note shape. It's not tonguing, and it's not starting notes and stopping notes. And there's so many things that have to come into play. The context of the music, the combination of the instruments that are playing, the composer's intent. And I'm not going to look at a staccato mark in a choral piece by Eric Whitacre the same way I'm going to look at a staccato mark by John Mackey at a tempo of 166. Yet we tell the students they're exactly the same. They're short notes. So I feel like we have to expand the palette of what it is that we're looking at and what we're wanting to achieve with the articulation so that we are really telling a story. This was several years ago. It has nothing to do with the book, but it just flashed in my mind. I was attended a workshop with the Capitol Brass, which are brass players from the DC area, the bands and their orchestra there. And I was amazed at how much of their clinic they spent. They were talking about music making and shaping of notes and all things musicality, how much they talked about the shape of notes and how much that meant to them in terms of how they express the music. So, and just like we can immediately, you can talk to somebody from Georgia and then turn around and talk to somebody from Chicago and then somebody from upper New England. And immediately the diction is going to define a great deal about that person. And they're all beautiful and they're all great. So I think that's my notion about articulation. I have countless examples in there and different ways to go about it other than just saying long, short, crisp, whatever. And then the second one, the reality of unconvincing dynamics. And this is something I told myself a number of years ago. It just kind of came to me and I've preached it ever since. Dynamics do not exist. They are of no consequence whatsoever until they're perceived by the listener. It's when the dynamics reach the person receiving the music, that's when they matter. So there's a great quote by Robert Shaw that I think says it all. He said, "The dynamics never sit. They are always in motion." And that became, I think, in fact, that is the subtitle of that particular chapter. I think that Shaw nailed it, that we have to constantly be thinking about dynamics. Dynamics are not a mark on the paper. Dynamics bring the music to life. And they're one of the basic tools that the composers have to decorate the music and create variety and expression. And I think in the band world, because of all those things, precision, accuracy, balance, blend, band sound, whatever that is, I have no idea. I know what a John Mackey sound is, and I know what a Persichetti sound is. I know what a Hennema sound is. I have no idea what a band sound is. You know what? I don't care. I want the sound that was in the heart and soul and the mind of that composer. That's what I'm going to try to achieve. And that's what I'm trying to challenge other people to want to achieve. But getting back to what I was saying about the particularly balance and blend, we will sacrifice almost anything for intonation, balance, and blend. We'll set everything else aside. And so it's very easy to end up living in an MF world. And nope, that's too loud, it's too bright, it's too brassy. No, that's too soft, it's too fuzzy sounding. Let's raise the dynamic up. And all of a sudden, we're compressed into this very small mid-range that has very little drama or life or vitality in it. So, and one of the things I also talk about in that chapter that I challenge everyone to think about, it's easy, and I'm most guilty of this, so I'm preaching to myself. Anybody else want to listen, just be my guest. But the reality, I don't think when I'm sitting down silently in a room and studying a score, I'm looking at harmony, I'm looking at dynamics, I'm looking at articulation, I'm looking at how am I going to teach that double dotted eighth notes, and what about those triplets? I don't want them to drag. I'm going through all those nuts and bolts stuff. And I think we forget sometimes that why shouldn't we also be hearing our head dynamics? We hear in our head the ink on the page, not the reality of what the final product is. So I personally, I've been really, really trying hard to get to the point that when I am studying a score, I'm thinking dynamics. I'm hearing dynamics. I'm hearing crescendos. Is that enough crescendo right there? Should it be more gradual than that? All those things I try to make as important to what I do as all the mechanics of the music. So getting to the point that the dynamics are easily, clearly perceived and are in consort with the content of the score is what I'm after. I had this is a name, there's some people out there, and Texas people for sure would remember a gentleman named Jerry Brumbaugh. He was a associate with my brother at Berkner High School in Richardson. He had a wonderful middle school band, but some people might take offense to this, but if you knew him, you know how funny it was. He talked about the fact that there were a lot of, he called them Hoover bands, like a Hoover vacuum cleaner. Yeah. And he said they were well tuned and the machinery worked well, but the concert was pretty much like you roll a bunch of Hoover vacuum cleaners out there and turn them on, and they go hoo, 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 for 10 minutes and they stop. They functioned totally perfectly correctly, but there was no soul and emotion. So maybe just avoiding the temptation to being a Hoover band might be what that whole chapter is about.
On those first two, because I know you discussed this in a couple different places, but how some of it's just notation is right. And I know you talk about later in one of the later scenes, but just the notation and the variations of what we see from composer to composer. And then as you're talking about, what is a staccato to a staccato? And same thing with dynamics, how sometimes there's limited dynamics on the page and making those choices. So just to hear you talk about, to hear it in your head when you're going through it, even that to make those choices even. But I know that's part of a challenge for especially younger directors.
Absolutely.
Trying to figure out, well, what is this? It says mezzo forte, it says forte for 42 measures or whatever that is making those choices too. Seems to be a challenge for directors and trying.
I think so. And Chad, I think also the directors, they want to figure out a way to objectify that. Okay. Give me an answer, put it in a box. Instead of letting the music guide them to the decision, they want to figure out a way to have a formula or a system that defines it for them, as opposed to letting the artistry of the music define it for them. I know there can be some big debates about this, but in many cases, my opinion, rhythmic notation is only approximate. It's not exact. We try to turn it into some kind of a math formula. A dotted 8th note and a 16th note is 3/4 of a beat as opposed to 1/4 of a beat. Well, that's what it looks like, and many times it is. But in many times, I think it is not. And there's countless examples in music that regard that. And sometimes I think trying to create that exactness makes the music so mechanical. Now, that is not to say if we're doing chart right on a fast machine or profanation or any of the fast music of John Mackey or anybody else you want to reference, yeah, I want the rhythms to be precise. I want them to be exact. But in other cases, rhythm is less precise. It's particularly true, I think, in dotted rhythms. And I thought of a term, actually, just earlier today when I was thinking about us having this visit this afternoon, is about, in math, particularly as we become more and more involved in the technology and so forth, there's a term that surfaced called fuzzy logic. Fuzzy math. And that was a kind of a new concept that says that no, everything is not exactly perfectly precise, that there has to be a little bit of ebb and flow, and that it's not just 1 versus 0, but there's variations within that. There is a fuzziness that's a part of logic that we have to apply. And so I've decided really and truly, sometimes rhythm should be fuzzy. They should be inexact. The first movement, one of the examples that I do talk about in the book is the first movement of Lincolnshire Posy. If you do the first movement and do that in a precise 6/8, it sounds wrong. It's really a long dotted note and then a dum-ba-dum-ba-dum. And if you go back and look at the words, you would never say the words exactly in the rhythm that it's written on that page. And if you go and listen to the folk songs that those were taken from, those people are not playing that rhythm. They're playing approximately that rhythm. And that's as close as we can get to that rhythm. we could go through countless examples, and in fact, I do go through many examples in the book, but in our desire to get it right, get it correct, somehow or another we fail maybe to get it right. Being obsessed with tempo markings. And to me, this is another one of those that is a major, major obsession with our band world. It says 144, come hell or high water, I'm going to get it 144. Well, maybe with your band, or maybe in the hall that you're playing in, I can come up with countless reasons that maybe 144 is not correct. Maybe 138 would be better. Maybe 156 would be better. I don't know which. I do know, and this I go into pretty much detail on one spot in this book. And by the way, within the book, I have countless examples of stories, of actual real life situations with major, major musicians talking about these very things. It's not something that I dreamed up on my back porch by any means. But there's a story that I share in there about Hindemith going to Keith Wilson at Yale and wanted him to read a new piece. And so Keith Wilson very carefully paired the piece. Boy, he got it exactly right. He made sure that every tempo was great. Hindemith came to the rehearsal. He got about 32 bars into the piece. Hindemith stopped him and ran down the aisle and up to him and says, "No, the tempo is all wrong. The tempo, you must fix the tempo." And Keith Wilson said to Hindemith, said, well, Paul, it's marked this tempo. I'm doing exactly the tempo. And he said, Hindemith looked at him and says, "Don't do the tempo that's marked, do the tempo that's right." And I can give you countless examples of that, of Aaron Copland talking about those things, and composers talking about changing their mind about tempos. So I think that it's very important for us to realize, number one, that there is that fluctuation of tempo. Now, sometimes if it's a piece, I'm going to composers, but there's some composers in their fast music. If it's 166, by golly, they want it 166. I'm going to do my best to do it at 166. And if I can't do it, if I can only do it at 144, and my band can't do it at 166, I'm not going to play that piece. Yeah. I'm going to be true to their expectations. But there's another side of the equation that I think that we have to really consider, and that is, and again, I'm picking on our band world, is our obsession with the metronome and constantly using that metronome to create some sense of structure and organization. And yes, there's times I would never sit down to score study without a metronome. I would never start a rehearsal without now it's my iPhone that's up there. I can constantly reference it, and I'm going to do that. But at the same time, I was doing a clinic a couple of years ago, I guess it was 3 years ago. And the piece that the gentleman had asked me to work on was Frank DeKelly's Rest. And so I asked him, I said, could you go ahead, do a recording a couple of days ahead of time and just put it on your phone and send it to me. I'd love to hear it. And that'll save us some time when we get there. So he sent me a recording of that absolutely stunning, stunning piece. And I put it on my speakers to listen to it. And the first thing I hear on the speakers is, and that kept going through the piece. That right there, that has nothing to do with Rest by Frank DeKelly. Nothing. And I sent it back to him and I said, can you please make a recording of it without the metronome so I can listen to the music? So those are some of the points that we're looking at and thinking about under that. So now we've gone through these first four sins, And these first four sins are all relatively objective. There's some sense of exactness in where you end up, even though we're talking about the fact that maybe less exactness would be more artistic. But then we get into the final three sins. The first of the final three is absence of line. And I think we have to always remember that music is a journey. Music is telling a story. And if we think of it measure per measure, and we're good craftsmen, we know how to do that stuff. If we're going to look at it measure per measure, rhythm per rhythm, note by note, rehearsal letter to rehearsal letter, we create a vertical contextual exactness that is, it's replicating what's on this page. It is. We can do that great. But think about it a second. What does an actor do? Do they go on stage and say lines? Do they go on and say words, or do they deliver lines? And I think that there's this danger of learning music vertically that makes it very difficult for us to tell the story, how the notes move forward. And I know we're going to get into this a little bit later, but I don't think you have to wait until somebody's playing Make Our Garden Grow or some very mature, difficult line before. A youngster or sixth grader can be influenced to play line once they know 5 notes. Okay. And in fact, pretty naturally, they'll want to play line. I remember Bob Duke, who is our music ed professor at University of Texas. And I love this. He says that when you have a young student and finally they can play a simple little melody, and so they come in to play the melody for them. Their chin is flat, they're patting their foot, they got all the notes in place, they got all the rhythms pretty much in. Their sound's a little young, it's a little fuzzy, we know that, it's gonna get there. And then we feel like we've done our job. Check the box, give them an A, send them on to the next line. He says, what if then you would say, Johnny, that was just great. I really thought that was a super, super job. Now, could you play that like you were playing a lullaby for your little brother? Or could you play that like you were going to scare your doggy? And all of a sudden there's an emotional connection. You know, they may squeak and squawk a little bit. Honestly, I'm to the point, I don't care, because they'll gradually get rid of the squeaks and squawks. But if we wait until later to think about this musicality, it's harder to breathe that into what they're doing. And that chapter has a number of verbal exercises people can do in the privacy of their room, learning how to take words and create inflection, just like we then need to take notes in music, notes and rhythms and create inflection.
I'll tell you on that chapter, there's a lot in there to go through and take in, and seeing you work with an ensemble. This is one of the parts, and it connects to some of the stuff in the first 4 with the dynamics, but the line and how much you work with that in an ensemble is a treat when you get into there. But one of the things you talked about that get in the way are the mechanics of playing, the emotions, or waiting, as you're saying, waiting until, okay, now we can play all the right notes, and now we can finally do all the emotional things. And then you even talked about the notation. I just think how that you kind of unpack some of that and go through that is helpful, but to also, like you said, just don't wait until later on to include the line portion of it.
No, start from the very beginning. I mean, that's where the music is. So always rehearse the music first, because we can get those other things done. But if we put things in a box and check them one at a time, it's very easy for us to fail to get to the ultimate beauty of what the music represents. And then we go from there into ignoring the role of silence. I don't know whether this is good or bad, right or wrong, but I've had, since the book's been out, I've had several people send me little notes that they found this particular chapter one of the more infatuating ones to them, because they were, I'm talking about some pretty advanced conductors and band directors that they said they had never really thought about silence in this context, that it's an essential part of music. Who was it? Yeah, Robert Bloom, oboist, said that rest or energy-filled silence. They're simply a silent note in the context of the music. But there's also the silence before the music. How does the music come out of the silence? Is it abrupt? Is it impatient to start? Is it hesitant to start? And these, again, I'm using a lot of non-musical terms: hesitant, impatient. That's where life is. Life is not in long and short, and loud and soft. And so it becomes, it is our canvas, and what happens before the music and during the music. And many times a rest is just a silent note within a phrase. Now, students are going to see a rest, and the first thing they're going to interpret is as a place for me to take a breath. They see it totally pragmatically. And we allow them to see it pragmatically because you can clean it up right there. It's a place for them to come up for air and get ready to go and go into the next phrase. But to think about it is just simply, that's just a pause in the music, and then it continues. And then at the end of the music, how does the music go back to silence? And when it gets back to silence, the end of a piece of music, do you want to hold the silence for a moment? Or is it one of those pieces that ends just majestically and victorious, and you want to immediately, whoa, done? Or is it one you want to just hold that for a moment before you say, yeah. That's part of music. And then the issue of silence, I talk a good deal in there about, what about the silence between movements? In some cases, let's take the Holst suite. Holst was very clear that he wanted almost no break between movement 1 and 2 and 2 and 3. They were almost very, very quickly. But I would argue then, I give a number of examples of this. If we go back and look, let's say English stances, Scottish stances, Malcolm Arnold, those are actually separate individual pieces, just put together in a very lovely, a very nice suite. But to me, in that particular case, I want a long break between each of those movements. I want, you get to the end of the movement, people have, yeah, that was pretty, I like that. And then you go on. You want there to be reflection. So those are all decisions that we have to make if we want to avoid the sin of ignoring how important silence might be. And then finally, and this is probably the hardest one to talk about at all, is the failure to consider proportion. And all nature, all architecture, in fact, all of our existence is defined in some relationships of proportion. And so much so that we just almost take them for granted. But I would argue that some of the very best marching band shows that I've ever seen, one of the things that made them absolutely spectacular, and I bet you would agree with this, is the beautifully proportioned relationship of everything that happens in that show, whether it's with the guard or whether it's the pacing of tempo, all of that goes under the umbrella of proportion and how we deal with that in a music. So how much of a retard do we want? How much should the crescendo be? Should it be sooner? Should it be later? Accelerando, how many times do we hear accelerandos, and the accelerando, I'm just grabbing a number out of the air, starts at 72 and it's supposed to go to 112, and it goes 72 and it gradually builds up to about 88. All of a sudden it's the end of and all of a sudden the tempo jumps 20 beats a minute to get, rather than creating that gradual. Those are things that have to be considered, I think, very carefully to make sure that we are somehow dealing with the beauty of the music and how we pace that. And again, I've tried. I don't know how well I've done, but I've tried very hard to include a number of examples. And I actually also go a little bit into the golden ratio. and into the world of artistry and proportion and the Fibonacci sequence, and how much those influence so many things in our life. But you just have to kind of wrap your head around thinking about it in a different way. But it's worth it. It's worth it, I think, to at least explore those things. And I don't think that any composer necessarily says, okay, this piece is going to be perfectly built on the golden ratio. That's not what happens. But something inside of us gravitates to that relationship. And then we as conductors and as teachers, we have to connect that relationship with our students and create that same kind of feeling for them. So that's pretty much the 7 that we're dealing with. And again, I intentionally put them in this order because the first 4 are more precise. They're more measurable. They're more objective, and that's okay. But then the final 3, that's when the real fun stuff comes in. Thinking about those things and how much that proportion, how much the role of silence and the absence of line play in the beauty of the music that we play.
It's just listening to is like a clinic, and then to know, and after reading the book, is like, this is just a tip of the iceberg of the examples and the sampling and the different, where you pull things and how you get to these 7 sins that are in the book. And there's other ideas that you haven't talked about that I've seen you use in rehearsals that are valuable and useful, they're inside of. So just the 7 things you've kind of talked about a little of them. There's so much more that you've written about also that's just helpful and advantageous to read through and take in. And hey, I've told this in a contest from a adjudicator. I've got this feedback before, and it's like, it was related to silence, and you have a chapter related to that on exactly what you're talking about. All those things come into play when you get into those performance situations, or there's so many of these elements, but there's so much more in the book, I know, also, besides just what you've gone through. You just kind of give us a little highlights of it and a little example of each one.
Yeah, and we might, if you want, we might say just a word about the last chapter, the 7 sins, and then the last chapter is about being an artist teacher. There was an article, I wish I had kept it. I really do, but I for some reason, this was years ago. I think it was actually all the way back when I was a Baylor, but it was an article, and it was in a British brass band journal that I was reading, periodical. And there was a gentleman, and I know he meant well in what he was saying, but he wrote this article trying to build a case that we shouldn't be called directors, that we shouldn't be called conductors, that really and truly what we should be called is trainers. And that what our job is to train students to play a certain way. And I know he was passionate in his belief, and I bet his groups played up a storm. I'm not saying that they didn't as far as the objective part of it. And I thought about a lot about the reality that we don't think much about being artists. I don't think I can recall. I remember for a while I kept thinking if I look long enough, sooner or later I would see it. I wanted to see a post on the yellow board that had the word artistry in it, because that's what we are. That's what we share. So the last chapter is really, to a great extent, is just a challenge for all of us to be more artistic in what we do. Gunther Schuller says that correctness, being correct, accomplishes very little. And that the more that we can push the dream of the artistry of the music, the more we can touch the life and soul of students. And yes, I know I'm using poetic words, but I sincerely believe that. And I talk in that chapter a lot about the necessity of reflection, sitting and thinking about things, and the distinction between knowing and feeling. You can know a lot and feel nothing. And I have a lot of comments and words and essays from other people that have allowed me to share them with you. And one, I love this one. If you imagine less, less will be what you undoubtedly deserve. So the notion that we want to push the envelope in terms of what we're doing and giving ways to possibly explore that. So the bottom line is that it's all about the art of what we do. It's not the craft, it's the art. And so I want us to try to be not just great teachers and great craftsmen, but to be great artists and to make those connections. And if I could, real quick, I'll just cite one example, but this was kind of, I think, one of your questions you brought up. What does this have to do with teaching the third band in a middle school someplace? And I think that, that it's important for us to realize and to remember, you do not have to wait until you're playing Angels in the Architecture or a whole suite or a Hymn in the Symphony to start having artistic feelings. Little people, little humans have artistic feelings. They do in every way. And it may be, I remember, I hadn't thought about this in forever, but this was Tommy Gilbert, who was my assistant director at Pierce High School. So I'm going all the way back into the 60s. People, I'm going a long way back. But we went to the sixth grades, elementary schools. We went to the sixth grade to teach beginning band. And some places you'd be in the cafeteria, some places you'd be on the stage. We'd see them for 35 minutes, 3 times a week. And that was it. But the book we used was the Bell and Band Builder. And I think on the second page of that book is the first time that there's any harmony. And it's 2 little quarter note, half note lines. And the lines are called Ike and Mike. And so you learn Ike, and then you learn Mike, and you can play Ike and Mike at the same time. And he was so excited, and he was laughing about it. He says, we finally did that. He said, we went through the one line, and he said, then we played through the other line. He said, and we put them together, and we got through. He said, Johnny, that little clarinet player, you know, that sits on my first seat, he said, now that's music. That kid just had an artistic experience. He really did. And if you want to see the artistic experiences that students have, just go to YouTube and start looking through some of the band performances. You know, if you scroll down the page, there's a place for people to put comments. And it's very interesting to go through and see what some students say about their pieces. Luke Zarunque, Eric Whitaker, a little boy wrote on there, he says, this is just audible chocolate. And I think we need to really, really remember that at whatever level, yeah, they're playing a little bit out of tune. They got a long way to go. They don't know all their alternate fingerings yet, but they are still having artistic experiences at their level of maturity. And we have to nurture those and feed them so that they become an incredibly important part of what we do.
Yeah, it's so valuable just because everybody, there's different levels and we're assigned to different groups. And this is what we have our students, especially now, just to know that you've got to still find a place of artistry and a chance for a kid to have some expression and some musicianship skills and experience that is so valuable to hear and to hear from you too. Hey, you should, find a way, whatever level you teach. You can find that, I think, when you play more advanced literature easier, but you can still do the same thing. Middle school, 3rd, 4th band at a high school. There's a place and you can find that. You just got to work and dig in, find the materials to do that, but so helpful for everybody to do that. So we've gone through the book. It's a wonderful, enjoyable, it's a great book, but it's also a great resource and it causes you to think a little bit and reflect and go through, and you talk about that in the last chapter also. And you've taught at all levels. We talked at the very beginning, so we're going to kind of turn a little bit. You've dealt with directors, you and your wife, you both clinic all over, and you do sessions all over the country, and talk with all sorts of different people and see people taking different levels. So what are some things that for directors, because the Hey Band Network is geared towards band directors, what are some characteristics you've seen some successful band directors, just people that have good solid programs that kids are learning and doing a lot, that are providing positive experiences at the level of that ensemble? It could be high school, middle school, college, any of those levels.
Yeah, I think it may be my bias, or maybe this is what I want to see, but I think that in most cases, one of the things that you consistently see, whether I'm looking at a middle school director or a high school director or a university conductor someplace, is that they are absolutely inspirational and passionate about what they're doing. It's an absolute love affair. And that's contagious. And I think that the reality is that kids react to what they think you believe, not what you say. The words you say reach them, yes, but what's behind those words, what they perceive to be fueling your passion, that's what's going to turn them on. Martin Luther King. He was not successful. He was not the impact that he was because he had a plan. A lot of people have a plan. He was successful because he had a vision. He had a dream. And if students perceive that you have a dream for what it is, and that dream is beyond keeping your right hand down when you go across the brake, and make sure you use your trigger when you're first and third, that the potential exists to touch them beyond just the notes and rhythms. And I see that, and I will not get into names, but some of the rehearsals I go to every year that around this area that I truly love is because that person on that podium, number one, loves the music, number one, knows his or her stuff, and number three, loves those kids. And nothing else matters but that. And I think that the very successful directors, I know Jerry Junkin and I have talked about this several times, but the fact that, and there's many others that I could reference in this comment, is the fact that I don't have a way that I rehearse college students, and then a way I rehearse high school students, and then a way I rehearse middle school. I may deliver it in a different way, but there's no difference, none whatsoever. I remember it was just the way the stars aligned. I was doing a clinic. I was going to do a clinic at Midwest, and the Army Band, U.S. Army Band, was going to be the demonstration group. And so I went to DC to do a rehearsal with them before that. And then that preceding week, I had done a middle school all-region band on Saturday. And then the preceding Friday night, I had conducted the Austin Symphonic Band on a concert. And if that wasn't an extreme, but the vision was the same for all three. There was no change whatsoever. And it was just, okay, how artistic can we be? What is the beauty? What is the passion? And can I be inspirational in doing that? And most of the people that I have the greatest admiration and respect for, that's the religion they practice. That's what they do. And I think to a great extent that's would be the most focused answer I could give on that is that, wonderful. And that you take, I said this on a recent podcast, so I'm repeating myself, but if you had asked me, if we'd been having this conversation that we're having today when I was 30 years old, and you asked me that, we would be here for a day and a half, because the book would be about this thick of all the stuff that I'm planning on getting through and going to have happen. Now that book then became smaller and smaller. There was less to it. And now it doesn't make any difference what level I'm working with. And some people will say, you don't work with middle school bands, do you? Well, yeah, it doesn't make any difference to me because I only have two goals anymore. I only have two goals. Number one is to guide those students to think for themselves and make judgments and decisions for themselves. And number two, take them someplace they have never been before. Now, that new place for a middle school student is very different than a new place for a high school student or a new place for a collegiate student. But the fact that we're just continually pushing the boundaries for them is what the ultimate goal is. So teach students to think for themselves and then take them someplace they've never been before.
It's wonderful. Yeah, it's hard to, as much experiences as you have and places and programs you've been around, not to ask you about what have you seen to be successful. It's like chapter number 9 of your book, of how to do this. And once you get through of the things to make music even better and evaluating and stuff, it's like, these are the things that are working for people too. And so just great to hear you talk about it and all your experience. So
yeah, thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful stuff. The last question I have for you is shout outs. Any shout outs you want to give?
Well, and this was not prearranged, but I would certainly, Chad, I'd give a shout out to you for developing this wonderful resource for all of us. And I think I do not know, and I say this often, but I don't know of a profession that is more sharing than music educators and band directors and teachers. And that we want to help each other. And it's a journey it's a communal journey. So I applaud you for that. I would also say that I am absolutely inspired by, and I am totally in awe of how our colleagues, how all the directors have met this challenge of what we're dealing with in 2020. It is absolutely amazing to me. And it's not just in Texas, it's across the country, at whatever level, whatever resources they have. I can't imagine another profession that is more committed to the continued well-being of their students. And I heard something the other day, and I think this is absolutely true. It was Liz Jackson Kirchhoff, who teaches in Minneapolis, but she was on a podcast with somebody, and I was listening to it, and they asked her, what are the things that we need to do that are so important for this time and the challenge that we're dealing with? And she said, I think that one of the things that we must constantly focus on is we must give our students hope. We may not be able to get to every finger when we'd like to, and every note that we would like to, and we can't teach like we would if we were in face-to-face day in and day out, but we can give students hope for the future and give students hope for the chance that we will make music again. We will be back at our passion as we enjoy it in groups. But I think it's important for us to all remind each other that, yeah, we're going to be okay, but we have to have that sense of hope in everything that we do.
For sure, absolutely. So, well, Mr. Floyd, I want to thank you very much for joining us on the Hey Band Network, and for all of our viewers, purchase this book, The 7 Deadly Sins of Music Making. It will, and those that are still teaching virtually, it'll help kind of, okay, so this is the stuff we have to look forward to when we get back to it. But take a look at it and read through it. It's a great read. It's a great resource. And just having you on as our guest today and talking about your book, it's been our pleasure and an honor to have you on the Hey Band Network. So thank you very much for joining me.
And it's been a joy and a pleasure for me as well, Chad. So best wishes for all good things.
Absolutely. So anybody watching, make sure you check out the Hey Band Network for this video and other videos in our mini series. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.